A little self-reflection before we read the passage this morning. This is the message here today is one of my favorite of all time, because we all at some times in our life have wanted to be a judge. So I read this with a heart that knows that I haven't followed it all my life, but that I need to do a better job of following it. Our scripture this morning is James, the 4th chapter, verses 11 and 12. Do not speak evil against one another, brothers and sisters. Whoever speaks evil against another or judges another speaks evil against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is one lawgiver and judge who is able to save and to destroy. So who, then, are you to judge your neighbor? The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
I'd start by inviting our children who are ages 3 through 5th grade to go ahead and make your way over to the playground. We have a number of fun things for you to do over there as mom and dad take time to listen to today's message. As I mentioned earlier, we're in the midst of a 4-part series called If I Were to Preach My Last Sermon. You see, our senior pastor, Greg Weeks, is on sabbatical for 4 weeks, and so we have had Pastor Phil and Pastor Winter start us off. I get the opportunity to share some thoughts with you today, and then Pastor Stephanie will wrap up the series this coming weekend. How many of you have seen the movie Home Alone? It's a good movie, isn't it? Very funny. For those of you who haven't seen it, I encourage you to go check it out. And basically, Home Alone is the story of a 7-year-old boy named Kevin McAllister. And Kevin's family decides that for Christmas this year, they're going to go on vacation and they're going to fly off to somewhere else and celebrate as a family. And so they are all busy getting packed, getting the luggage in the cars, and they all get on I think they had a van, and they all go off to the airport. They get on the airplane, and they take off, all excited to start their vacation, only to discover that they have left 7-year-old Kevin home alone. And Kevin, trying to be as adult as he can, first of all, he's excited because he gets to, try his dad's razor and shaving cream and do all kinds of fun things. And he also gets to try to outsmart or outwit these, let's call them 2 incompetent criminals who are trying to break into his house while he's home alone. But in the middle of this story, there is this character who's kind of rough and grumpy looking, and he's called Old Man Marley. Now, Old Man Marley lives next door to the McAllisters. He lives alone. And the kids in the neighborhood have made up this legend or this story about Marley that he is a serial killer. And in fact, that he has murdered his wife, and that if you're not careful, he will murder you too. And so these kids are absolutely petrified of Old Man Marley. Well, on Christmas Eve night, Kevin, being home alone, decided that he wanted to continue to do the traditions that his family did if they had been there. And so he went off to church, and he found a pew, and he was sitting in that pew, and guess who walks up? Old Man Marley. And here's what happened.
Merry Christmas. May I sit down? That's my granddaughter up there, the little red-haired girl. She's about your age. You know her?
No.
You live next to me, don't you?
Yeah.
You can say hello when you see me. You don't have to be afraid. There's a lot of things going around about me, but none of it's true. Okay? Been a good boy this year?
I think so.
You swear to it?
No.
Yeah, I had a feeling. Well, this is the place to be if you're feeling bad about yourself.
It is?
I think so.
Are you feeling bad about yourself?
No.
I've been kind of a pain lately. I said some things I shouldn't have. I really haven't been too good this year.
Yeah.
I'm kind of upset about it because I really like my family. Even though sometimes I say I don't. Sometimes I even think I don't. Do you get that?
I think so. How you feel about your family is a complicated thing.
Especially with an older brother.
Deep down, you always love them. But you can forget that you love them. And you can hurt them and they can hurt you. And that's not just because you're young.
So we see in this scene that old man Marley isn't as bad as he thought, right? Kevin opens up and shares a little bit about his backstory with this man, and a little bit later, this man shares a little bit about his story. And we come to find out that he's not a serial killer, but rather he is a grieving father who has become estranged from his son and from his daughter-in-law and his granddaughter. And it's Christmas time. And you know, one of the things about this story is I think it shows how when we stop and we don't judge, and we instead engage in conversation, we share a little bit about our story, we listen to a little bit about someone else's story, a relationship forms. And while Home Alone is really a comedy movie, I think it speaks to the truth about how we so easily judge other people. We judge them before we really know who they are, what their backstory is. We look at how someone dresses, how they talk, how they behave, maybe what tattoos they have, how they cut their hair, or who they love, or where they work, maybe how they voted, or even what they post on social media. And we can't help but judge them. Sometimes we just judge them in the quiet of our own minds, and other times we share our judgments out loud. We tell other people our criticisms and our distaste of what they are doing. And you know, oftentimes I don't even think we realize we're doing it. I once heard someone say, "I don't judge the stupid things that other people do." Maybe you've even said that at times. In our scripture passage this morning, we hear these words: "Do not speak evil against one another, brothers and sisters." Well, that's pretty straightforward, right? If you're like me, though, I like to know the why behind things. And fortunately, James is kind enough to give us the why when he goes on to explain that whoever speaks evil against another or judges another speaks against the law and actually judges the law. But if you judge the law, you're not a doer of the law anymore, but rather you are a judge. Now that's a mouthful. So let's see if we can unpack this together. When I speak critically of someone else, I am assuming the role of the judge. I'm putting myself in a position of superiority over that person. I'm lowering their role and I'm elevating my role. What James is telling us, I believe, is that we're really putting ourselves in the place of the one and true and holy judge, God. Here's how James says it. He says, "There is one lawgiver and one judge, God, who is able to save and to destroy. So who then are you to judge your neighbor?" So how can we live into this truth this morning? Well, I have two suggestions, and they are vulnerability and empathy. I want you to start by thinking of your own backstory, your own childhood, your own adolescence, maybe your own school experiences, your hurts, your failures, your wins, and your triumphs. Let's call all of these experiences your backstory. Do you think that those things have influenced and shaped in some way who you are today? How you show up to conversations, how you respond and react to the people in the world around you? Do you think? Of course, how can they not? Our experiences of our life influence who we are. Now, I want you to think of a person in your life that maybe makes you frustrated or upset or even angry. Some of you just turn to the person sitting next to you. Don't worry, we're going to have counseling afterwards. Can we agree that the person that you just thought about also has a backstory? That they have experiences in their lives that have shaped and guided and influenced who they are and how they react to you and to the people around them? Now, one more person I want you to think about, and that is someone who dresses differently, who talks differently, who lives differently, who loves differently, who votes differently. You fill in the blank differently. And can we agree for a moment that this person, these people, also have a backstory, a world that is influenced by the experiences of their past? Friends, we each have a backstory that shapes and influences who we are and how we respond to the world around us. And I believe that our problem isn't that we don't know this, but we often aren't vulnerable enough to share it, to open ourselves, and we aren't empathetic enough to listen to others when they share their backstory. Have you ever snapped at somebody? Maybe it's a family member or coworker, or maybe even a complete stranger at that retail store at Christmas time. Or maybe you didn't full go off on somebody, but maybe you made a sarcastic comment, a passive-aggressive remark that stung and hurt them. I know I have at times, and truth be told, I've been on both the giving and receiving end of this situation more times than I care in my life. And you know what I've discovered? In most cases, the intensity of my reaction has less to do with what they have said or done and more to do with what's going on in my own life and what has been left unaddressed in my past. So before we go on, I just want to know, can we all get real for a little bit? Can we take off the mask? Can we stop pretending that we have to have it all together? And can we all just be beautifully broken for a moment? Yes? Are you awake? Yeah? I want you to turn to someone near you and I want you to say to them, I am beautifully broken and so are you. Some of you really enjoyed that, especially the so are you part. Okay, so we're all vulnerable now. We're all in the same vulnerable space. This is a safe place, okay? Let me do a little experiment here. Let me do a little demonstration. Let's pretend you have never met me before. I know some of you in here haven't, but for those of you who have, let's pretend you've never met me before and you walk in here today and I'm standing before you. What can you tell about me just by looking at me? Shout it out. I'm a big man. I like food. I'm a pastor. I have one of these robes on. What's that? I'm a happy person. Yes. I'm losing what hair I have left. Yes. I have glasses, right? If you look here, you might see that I'm married to this beautiful woman right here. I'll get in trouble for that later. Yeah, so you can see some basic things about me. You might assume that I have some kind of education because I'm up here preaching, right? That I live in this area because I am employed at the church here. Now, some of you know a bit more about my backstory. You've known me for a little bit. And so you might know that I also enjoy gardening, that I enjoy photography, that I am a process person. I love looking at a situation and figuring out a process. I'm innovative. I like thinking about new ways to do things. I used to be a former marketing professional. And so some of you know me and you know my backstory a little bit, and so you know those things. Now, some of you know me a little bit deeper. You know a little bit more about my backstory, and you know that I'm an only child, that I am a first-generation college graduate. Some of you know that my dad died in a house fire when I was 17, and that I barely made it out. that the doctor said there's no reason I should have ever woken up from all the smoke. Others of you know that my wife and I had a beautiful son named Christian Peich, and that we had him for 12 weeks before he passed and went on to heaven. And yet others of you know that we have since gone on to adopt two beautifully wonderful children named Lucas and Samantha, who are playing over in the playground this morning. So there's more to my backstory than meets the eye. Some of you know that story, and yet would you be surprised to know that my backstory goes even deeper than that? That I am the child of two alcoholics, that I grew up in a dysfunctional home, that I am the survivor of abuse, that I have OCD, or as I like to say, CDO, because that's the proper order of those letters. That I like to use sugar and food as a coping mechanism. Instead of going to God, I tend to turn to food. You can see how that's working out. Maybe some of you can relate. As a result, I have a low self-body image. All of these are part of my backstory. Another piece of my backstory is that I have taken advantage of the opportunity to seek counseling. Yes, your pastor is in counseling, and since this is supposed to be my very last sermon ever, so should you. Now, why would I be crazy enough to share these very personal things about my life with you? Because, friends, I believe with all of my heart that when we come to understand the power of our backstories, we also become able to understand how God's unconditional love and amazing grace can permeate our lives in new and incredible ways. Because I also want to model for you what it looks like to own and to courageously share your backstory without shame. Without shame. And to testify to the important and awesome power of our God to transform brokenness into beauty. And finally, because I want you to feel what it's like to hear another person's backstory and to listen with empathy and with love. One of my favorite authors and researchers is named Brené Brown, and she had this to say: "When we deny our stories, they define us. Yet when we own our stories, we get to write a brave new ending." Friends, when we own and share our backstory, we practice vulnerability and we reveal the truth that none of us are perfect. We are all beautifully broken. And we profess the truth unashamedly that the only perfect one is God. Friends, when we own and share our backstory, we proclaim the amazing grace, the hope, the joy, and the peace that only God can provide as God turns brokenness into beauty. Brené describes it this way. She says, "We cultivate love when we allow our most vulnerable and powerful selves to be deeply seen and known. If we want greater clarity in our purpose or deeper and more meaningful spiritual lives, vulnerability is the path." Did you hear that? Vulnerability is the path. So what's your backstory? Now, some of you have done lots of good work processing, sharing, and understanding your past. And I imagine others of you are tensing up with the thought of just thinking about some of the things that have happened in your history. But what if you drive around town without one of these in your car? What happens? You can't see what's coming from behind you, and very possibly something from behind you, something from your past, can come crashing into you, and you don't even know what hit you, because you never even saw it coming. And so, friends, I'd like to say that we need to sometimes look back so that we can move forward. We sometimes need to look back so that we can move forward. Now, make no mistake, owning our backstory is sometimes very hard work because it means that we need to unpack and process what's happened in our lives. And for some of us, there are some things we'd rather just not talk about. Yet if we don't understand our backstory, we can end up in a place of resentment, of denial, of repeating family dynamics, and unhealthy behaviors. Does anybody here want that? No. Brene gives it to us straight when she says, owning our story can be hard, but not nearly as difficult as spending our lives running from it. And embracing our vulnerabilities is risky, but not nearly as dangerous as giving up on love and belonging and joy, the experiences that make us the most vulnerable. And so, friends, that's why I take advantage of counseling. Yes, your pastor sees a counselor, and I am proud of it. I want to embrace my vulnerabilities. I want to bring light to the dysfunctional patterns of my past and hopefully improve how I show up and how I act and respond as your pastor, as your friend, as a husband, and as a father. I see a counselor, and I wholeheartedly invite you to as well. So up until now, we've really been talking about our own backstory. I'd like to change gears for just a moment and really talk about other people's backstories. And I've discovered the more work I do on my own backstory that I have a new perspective on how I relate and respond to other people. Take, for example, when someone snaps or they yell at me. I could either snap right back and say, "What the heck? Where did that come from?" Right? And respond in kind to what they did to me. Or I could quietly be offended and walk over here and tell everybody else what a jerk they are. Maybe you've experienced that. Or I could choose to not take it personally. I could recognize that that person's response is probably more about something that happened in their day, their week, their past, than it is to do with me personally. And I could see that as a holy opportunity to respond in love and hopefully at some point learn more about this child of God. Here's another scenario for you. What about that person in our neighborhood or school or workplace, and yes, even this church that is different than me? I could judge them for dressing differently, talking differently, behaving differently. I could criticize them for who they are or how they voted or what they post on social media. Another option is I could be offended by what they've done and then go on to tell others how strange and disruptive I think they are. Or I could choose to believe that their choices are likely influenced by their backstory and see this as a holy opportunity to start a conversation where I can listen and I can learn and I can get to know another child of God. You see, when we learn about a person's backstory, we humanize them. And when we discover the humanity in others, I believe we come to realize that they too have feelings and struggles and worries and doubts. And when we start to see other people as beautifully broken, just like all of us are, they become so much more difficult to judge and to criticize. Now, let me say that learning someone else's backstory often takes grace and, yes, patience. A backstory is not something that somebody usually just shares at the first meeting that you have with them. It'll take time and grace and ultimately a relationship. And for those of you who think, well, I am an excellent judge of character, I can see somebody and I can just tell you what their backstory is, baloney. I have two examples just to make this point for you this morning. The first is someone who didn't speak until he was 4 years old. He failed his college entrance exam, and while he did eventually graduate from the college, he struggled and nearly dropped out on several occasions because he did so poorly. In fact, he was in such dire straits that at the time of his father's death, his father considered him to be a major failure. This left him completely heartbroken and bruised. After graduating, this person wandered, unsure of what to do with his life. And after all options had been exhausted, he ended up taking a job as an insurance salesman, going door to door to door, trying to get people to buy life insurance. Who is this person? His name is Albert Einstein, and he brought us the theory of relativity and helped us to reach deeper understandings of our universe. He's a Nobel Prize winner, and he created the beginning of quantum theory. Friends, today we look at him as a genius, but his backstory leading up to what we know about him today is anything but that. Our second example grew up with a tumultuous childhood that included difficult times and often strained relationships with her father. Her mother struggled with an illness, and at the age of 17, she was rejected from college. In 1990, her mother died from multiple sclerosis, leaving her extremely distraught and upset. In the wake of her mother's death, she met a man, she got married, got pregnant, and gave birth to a daughter. But the relationship was very strenuous, and with reports of domestic abuse, it resulted in a separation and ultimately a divorce. At the age of 38, this woman moved to live with her sister, and at that point, she considered herself and her life to be a failure. She was diagnosed with clinical depression and was suicidal. Yet 2 years later, she managed to finish a manuscript of a little book she had been working on. She found an agent, and they spent the next year trying to find a publishing house to publish the book. All 12 of the major publishing houses turned her away. It wasn't until 1996 when a very small publishing house finally gave her a green light and a very small cash advance. And the initial idea for a young wizard named Harry Potter was first published. And by 2004, J.K. Rowling was the first author to become a billionaire with a B from her writings. Could you have ever guessed either of their backstories? No. And so, friends, if this truly were my last sermon with you, I think I would leave you with two thoughts. One, I would invite you to look for holy opportunities to share your backstory with others, to be vulnerable, to realize that we are all beautifully broken. And two, I would invite you to find holy opportunities to stop judging and start inviting others to share their story, their journey with you. Friends, aren't you glad that we serve a God who turns brokenness into beauty? Amen.